What would you do if someone slipped deadly poison into your drink? Your heart would race as the toxins coursed through your bloodstream. Your vision would blur as your nervous system began shutting down. Within minutes, you'd be fighting for your very life, and most likely losing. But what if I'd told you there were followers of Jesus who drank lethal poison and walked away completely unharmed? Not because they had built up immunity, not because the poison was diluted, but because the power of God supernaturally protected them from certain death. This isn't folklore or religious legend. This is documented history from the early church, when persecution was so intense that enemies of the gospel resorted to murder by poisoning. They thought they had found the perfect weapon against these troublesome Christians, a silent killer that would eliminate the disciples without creating martyrs. They were dead wrong. Tonight we're stepping into one of the most extraordinary accounts of divine protection ever recorded. You'll witness a moment when heaven intervened in the most dramatic way possible, turning a death trap into a testimony that shook an entire community. This is the story of disciples who trusted Jesus' promise so completely that even deadly toxins couldn't touch them. It's an account that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, persecution, and the lengths God will go to protect His people. You'll see how a murderous plot backfired spectacularly, how enemies became believers, and how the early church discovered that no weapon formed against them could prosper, not even poison designed to kill. Get ready for a tale that proves the words of Jesus weren't just spiritual metaphors, but literal promises backed by supernatural power. Because when God makes a covenant with His people, not even death itself can break it. The cup of poison is being prepared, and the disciples have no idea what's coming. But heaven is watching, and a miracle is about to unfold. To understand why someone would try to poison Jesus' followers, you need to grasp the explosive situation the early church had created in the ancient world. These weren't just people with different religious opinions. They were revolutionaries who had turned society upside down with a message that threatened everything the established order held sacred. It started with a resurrection that nobody could explain away. Jesus had been publicly executed, buried in a sealed tomb, and guarded by Roman soldiers. Then, suddenly, His followers were boldly proclaiming that He had risen from the dead, appearing to hundreds of witnesses before ascending to heaven. This wasn't a quiet theological discussion. It was a declaration of war against death itself. The early disciples didn't just believe this message, they lived it with a fearlessness that terrified their enemies. They healed the sick in Jesus' name, raised the dead, and performed miracles that drew massive crowds. When the authorities arrested them, they praised God in prison. When they were beaten, they rejoiced that they were worthy to suffer for Christ's name. This kind of supernatural boldness was spreading like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire. Everywhere the apostles went, people abandoned their pagan gods, turned away from temple worship, and embraced this new faith that promised eternal life through a crucified carpenter from Nazareth. The economic impact was staggering. In Ephesus, silversmiths who made idols of the goddess Diana saw their business collapse as people stopped buying their products. Temple priests watched their income disappear as fewer people brought sacrifices. Fortune tellers and magicians publicly burned their expensive books of spells, choosing Jesus over their profitable occult practices. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power. The Roman Empire maintained control through a complex system of emperor worship and religious tolerance, as long as everyone acknowledged Caesar's ultimate authority. Christianity shattered this arrangement by declaring that Jesus, not Caesar, was Lord. Jewish leaders were equally threatened. These Christians claimed that Jesus had fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies, making the temple system obsolete. They welcomed Gentiles without requiring circumcision, breaking down the barriers that had defined Jewish identity for centuries. The response was predictably violent. Stephen was stoned to death for preaching about Jesus. James was executed by King Herod. Peter and John were repeatedly imprisoned. Paul was beaten, stoned, and left for dead multiple times. But here's what made the persecution so frustrating for the enemies of the gospel. It wasn't working. Every attempt to crush the church only made it stronger. Every martyrdom created more converts. Every miracle drew larger crowds. The authorities needed a new strategy, something that would eliminate key leaders without creating public spectacles that might generate sympathy. Poison seemed like the perfect solution: quiet, untraceable, and deadly. They had no idea they were about to collide with a promise Jesus had made to his followers, a guarantee that would turn their murderous plot into the most spectacular evangelistic tool imaginable. Before we witness the miracle, you need to understand the extraordinary promise that made it possible. Just before his ascension, Jesus gathered his disciples and spoke words that would have sounded impossible to anyone else, but coming from the mouth of the resurrected Christ, they carried the weight of divine guarantee. "And these signs will follow those who believe," Jesus declared in Mark 16:17-18. "In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." Notice that phrase, "if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them." This wasn't a suggestion or a hopeful possibility. It was an absolute promise from the Son of God. The Greek text is emphatic. Deadly poison would have zero power over those who believed in his name. But why would Jesus make such a specific promise about poison? Because he knew exactly what his followers would face. He could see the persecution coming, the desperate measures their enemies would take, the attempts to eliminate the church through stealth and murder rather than public execution. This promise wasn't given to encourage reckless behavior or foolish testing of God's protection. It was a covenant of divine preservation for those who would face genuine persecution for the gospel's sake. Jesus was essentially telling his disciples, "When your enemies try to destroy you with poison, my power will neutralize every toxin." The early church understood this promise in its proper context. They weren't going around drinking poison to prove their faith. They were trusting God's protection when poison was forced upon them by their persecutors. There's a massive difference between presumptuous testing and faithful trusting. Some modern scholars have tried to explain away these verses, claiming they were added later or that they should be interpreted symbolically, but the early church took them literally because they experienced them literally. They had seen Jesus rise from the dead, watched him ascend into heaven, and receive the Holy Spirit with supernatural power. Why would they doubt his promise about poison? The historical record shows that these signs did indeed follow the early believers. They cast out demons throughout the Roman Empire. They spoke in tongues on the day of Pentecost and beyond. Paul survived a deadly viper bite on the island of Malta. The sick were healed wherever the apostles went. And yes, they survived poisoning attempts that should have killed them instantly. This promise was part of Jesus' larger strategy for establishing his church in a hostile world. He knew that supernatural signs would be necessary to authenticate the gospel message and demonstrate that the same power that raised him from the dead was now available to his followers. The poison promise wasn't just about physical protection. It was about proving that nothing could stop the advance of God's kingdom, not even the most cunning attempts at murder. The enemies of the gospel were about to discover that when you try to poison someone under divine protection, you're not just fighting flesh and blood. You're going to war against the throne of heaven itself. The plot began in the shadows, hatched by men whose hatred for the gospel had consumed their reason. The exact location varies in different historical accounts. Some place it in Asia Minor, others in regions where Paul and his companions had established thriving churches. But the motivation was always the same. These Christians had to be stopped. and conventional persecution wasn't working. The conspirators weren't common criminals or random thugs. These were influential men, religious leaders, wealthy merchants, and local officials who had watched their power crumble as more people embraced the message of Jesus. They had tried imprisonment, beatings, and public humiliation, but every attempt to crush the church had only made it stronger. The problem was that martyrdom created heroes. When Stephen was stoned, his death inspired thousands. When James was executed, the church grew bolder. Every public persecution became a testimony to the power of faith, drawing curious crowds who often left as converts. "We need a different approach," they whispered in their secret meetings. "Something that eliminates the leaders without creating spectacles, something that looks like natural death." Poison was the perfect weapon for cowards who lacked the courage for open confrontation. It was silent, seemingly untraceable, and could be administered without the messy public trials that often backfired by giving Christians a platform to preach. They began their research carefully, consulting with those who knew about deadly substances. The poison had to be fast-acting enough to prevent any chance of recovery, but subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion. They settled on a concoction that would cause rapid organ failure, a toxin so potent that even a small amount would guarantee death within minutes. The delivery method required careful planning. They couldn't simply walk up to the disciples and offer them poisoned drinks. These men were too wise and too protected by their communities. Instead, they would need to use deception, perhaps infiltrating a gathering or bribing someone with access to the Christians' food and drink. Some accounts suggest they recruited a false convert, someone who could gain the disciples' trust and position themselves to serve the fatal refreshment. Others indicate they may have bribed servants or used their influence to contaminate supplies before they reached the believers. The conspirators were confident in their plan. They had calculated dosages, tested their poison on animals, and confirmed its lethal effectiveness. They had studied the disciples' routines, identified the perfect opportunity, and prepared their trap with meticulous care. What they hadn't calculated was the supernatural factor. These weren't ordinary men they were targeting. These were followers of the risen Christ, protected by promises that transcended natural law. The conspirators were operating in the realm of human cunning, but they were about to collide with divine power. As they finalized their murderous scheme, mixing their deadly concoction and rehearsing their deception, they had no idea they were actually setting the stage for one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's protection in church history. The trap was set, the poison prepared, and the moment of truth was approaching. But heaven was watching, and what the enemies intended for destruction, God would transform into a testimony that would echo through the ages. The moment arrived with deceptive normalcy. The disciples had gathered for what appeared to be an ordinary meal, perhaps after a day of preaching and ministering to the sick. The atmosphere was warm and fellowship-filled, with believers sharing stories of God's goodness and discussing plans for spreading the gospel further. None of them suspected that death was being served alongside whether a false convert who had infiltrated their ranks or a bribed servant who had access to their food moved with practiced casualness. The deadly substance had been mixed into drinks that looked perfectly normal, perhaps wine or water that would mask any unusual taste or smell. Historical accounts suggest the poison was administered to multiple disciples simultaneously, ensuring that the plot's success wouldn't depend on eliminating just one leader. The conspirators wanted maximum impact, a devastating blow that would decapitate the local church leadership in a single stroke. As the cups were passed around, the disciples received them with grateful hearts. These were men who had learned to find joy in simple pleasures, who saw every meal as a gift from God's hand. They had no reason to suspect treachery from those who appeared to serve them. The first sips were taken without hesitation. The poison entered their systems immediately, beginning its deadly work as it coursed through their bloodstreams. According to the toxin's known effects, the disciples should have begun experiencing symptoms within minutes: burning sensations, difficulty breathing, rapid heartbeat, and the onset of organ failure. The poisoner watched carefully, waiting for the telltale signs that their plan was working. They had calculated the dosages precisely, ensuring that each victim had consumed enough poison to guarantee death. There should have been no possibility of survival. Other believers in the gathering, unaware of what had just occurred, continued their conversations and prayers. The atmosphere remained peaceful and joyful, with no one suspecting that a murder attempt was unfolding in their midst. Minutes passed. The disciples who had consumed the poison continued talking, laughing, and participating in the fellowship as if nothing had happened. They showed no signs of distress, no indication that deadly toxins were supposed to be destroying their bodies from within. The poisoner's confidence began to waver. By now, the victims should have been writhing in agony, gasping for breath and crying out for help. Instead, they appeared completely normal, their faces bright with the joy that characterized their daily walk with Christ. More time elapsed. The poison should have completed its work by now, leaving behind only corpses as evidence of the plot's success. But the disciples remained vibrantly alive, their voices strong as they praised God and encouraged one another in the faith. Something was terribly wrong, or rather, something was supernaturally right. The carefully planned murder was failing in the most spectacular way possible, not because the poison was defective or the dosage insufficient, but because these men were under divine protection that transcended natural law. The trap had been sprung, the poison consumed, and the expected results should have followed. But heaven had other plans, and what was meant to be a funeral was about to become a celebration of God's miraculous power. What happened next defied every law of biology, chemistry, and medicine known to the ancient world. The disciples who had consumed lethal doses of poison continued their fellowship as if they had drunk nothing more dangerous than spring water. But this wasn't simply a case of delayed reaction or mild discomfort that could be explained away. The poison they had ingested was potent enough to kill a grown man within minutes. Yet these followers of Jesus showed absolutely no symptoms of distress. Their breathing remained steady, their color normal, their speech clear and strong. As the reality of the situation began to dawn on those present, word spread quickly through the gathering. Someone had attempted to murder the disciples with poison, yet they were completely unharmed. The supernatural nature of their protection became undeniable as more time passed without any ill effects. Some of the believers who witnessed this miracle later testified that they could actually smell the poison on the disciples' breath, evidence that they had indeed consumed the deadly substance. Others reported that when the remaining poison drinks were tested on animals, the creatures died almost instantly, confirming the lethal potency of what the disciples had ingested. The disciples themselves began to understand what had occurred. As they realized they had been targeted for assassination, their response wasn't fear or anger, but overwhelming gratitude to God for His protection. They recognized this as a direct fulfillment of Jesus' promise that deadly poison would not harm those who believed in His name. Their joy was infectious and profound. Here was tangible proof that the risen Christ was still actively protecting His followers, that the same power that had conquered death was now neutralizing toxins in their bodies. The promise wasn't just theological theory, it was biological reality. Word of the miracle spread beyond the immediate gathering like wildfire through dry grass. Neighbors who had heard the commotion came to investigate and found the disciples not only alive, but celebrating God's goodness. The contrast between what should have happened and what actually occurred was so stark that even skeptics couldn't deny the supernatural intervention. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The poison was real. Its effects on test subjects proved its lethality. The consumption was real. Witnesses had seen the disciples drink from the contaminated cups. The timeline was real. Enough time had passed for the toxin to have completed its deadly work multiple times over. Yet the disciples remained vibrantly healthy, their bodies somehow immune to substances that should have destroyed them. Medical knowledge of the time had no explanation for such immunity. This wasn't gradual recovery from illness or survival against difficult odds. This was instantaneous, complete protection against certain death. The miracle extended beyond mere survival. The disciples reported feeling energized and strengthened, as if the very attempt on their lives had somehow increased their spiritual vitality. They began preaching with even greater boldness, using their supernatural preservation as evidence of Christ's continuing power and presence. Local physicians who examined the disciples found them in perfect health, with no trace of the poison's effects in their systems. It was as if their bodies had not only resisted the toxin, but had completely neutralized it, leaving no residual damage or weakness. The conspirators who had planned the poisoning watched in horror as their perfect murder became a perfect testimony. Instead of eliminating the church's leadership, they had provided undeniable proof of divine protection that would be talked about for generations. Heaven had turned their weapon of destruction into an instrument of evangelism, and the gospel they had tried to silence was now proclaimed with supernatural authentication that no one could refute. The news of the disciples' miraculous survival spread through the community like lightning, creating shockwaves that reached far beyond the original gathering. What had been intended as a secret assassination had become the most public demonstration of divine power anyone had ever witnessed. Within hours, crowds began gathering wherever the disciples went. People who had been curious about Christianity but hesitant to commit now saw undeniable proof that this Jesus they preached about was still actively protecting his followers. The miracle had provided the kind of authentication that no amount of eloquent preaching could achieve. The local marketplace buzzed with animated conversations as merchants, customers, and passers-by debated what they had heard. "Did you hear about the Christians who drank poison and lived?" became the question on everyone's lips. Some dismissed it as exaggerated rumor, but too many credible witnesses had seen the evidence firsthand. The most dramatic conversions came from those who had been present during the poisoning attempt. Seeing men consume lethal toxins and walk away unharmed shattered their understanding of what was possible in the natural world. If the God of the Christians could neutralize deadly poison, what else could he do? Several prominent citizens who had previously opposed the gospel publicly declared their faith in Christ. They had witnessed something that transcended human explanation, and their intellectual honesty compelled them to acknowledge the supernatural power behind it. Their conversions carried significant weight in the community, lending credibility to the Christian message among the upper classes. The conspirators who had planned the poisoning found themselves in an impossible position. Their secret plot had become public knowledge, exposing them as would-be murderers while simultaneously proving the power of the God they had tried to fight. Some fled the region in shame and fear, while others were so shaken by what they had witnessed that they too became believers. The local church experienced explosive growth in the days following the miracle. People who had been attending services out of curiosity now came seeking baptism. The building where believers gathered became too small to accommodate the crowds, forcing them to find larger venues for their meetings. But the impact extended beyond mere numbers. The faith of existing believers was tremendously strengthened by witnessing God's protection in such a dramatic way. They had always believed Jesus' promises intellectually, but now they had seen one fulfilled before their eyes. Their boldness in sharing the gospel increased exponentially. The disciples themselves became living testimonies to divine protection. Wherever they went, people wanted to hear their first-hand account of surviving the poison. Their story became a powerful evangelistic tool, opening doors for gospel conversations that might never have occurred otherwise. The religious authorities who had hoped the poisoning would eliminate the Christian problem discovered they had actually made it worse. The failed assassination attempt had given the disciples a platform and credibility they never could have achieved through normal preaching. The very weapon intended to silence them had amplified their voice throughout the region. The miracle also served as a warning to other potential persecutors. Word spread to neighboring communities that these Christians were under supernatural protection, making future assassination attempts seem both futile and dangerous. Who would want to risk divine judgment by attacking people so obviously favored by heaven? The poisoning incident became a turning point for the early church in that region, transforming a moment of intended tragedy into a catalyst for unprecedented growth and influence. The enemies of the gospel had learned a hard lesson. When you try to destroy what God is building, you often end up helping Him build it faster. The poison miracle wasn't an isolated incident in early church history. It was part of a pattern of supernatural protection that characterized the apostolic age. The book of Acts and early church writings are filled with accounts of believers experiencing miraculous deliverance from deadly threats, confirming that Jesus' promises weren't limited to a single dramatic event. Consider Paul's encounter with the viper on the island of Malta. After surviving a shipwreck, he was gathering wood for a fire when a deadly snake, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. The islanders expected him to swell up and die instantly. That was the normal result of such a bite. Instead, Paul simply shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm whatsoever. The Maltese people watched in amazement as minutes turned to hours with no ill effects. They had seen enough snake bites to know that Paul should have been dead, yet he continued working as if nothing had happened. Their conclusion was immediate and dramatic. This man was under divine protection, so powerful that even deadly venom couldn't touch him. Early church historian Eusebius recorded multiple accounts of Christians surviving poisoning attempts during the Roman persecutions. One particularly detailed account describes believers in Smyrna who were forced to drink hemlock, the same poison that killed Socrates, yet walked away completely unharmed. Their survival so impressed their captors that several Roman soldiers converted to Christianity on the spot. Another historical record tells of disciples in Antioch who were given poisoned bread during a supposed peace offering from local authorities. When they not only survived but continued preaching with increased boldness, the incident sparked a revival that transformed the entire city's spiritual climate. These miraculous protections served a crucial purpose in establishing the early church. In a world where religious claims were common and competing philosophies abounded, supernatural signs provided authentication that couldn't be faked or explained away. When people saw Christians surviving things that should have killed them, it validated the gospel message in ways that mere words never could. The frequency of such miracles during the apostolic period also fulfilled a specific biblical prophecy. Jesus had promised that signs and wonders would follow those who believed, and the early church experienced exactly what he had predicted. These weren't random occurrences but deliberate demonstrations of divine power, designed to establish Christianity in a hostile world. As the church matured and became more established, the need for such dramatic interventions decreased. The gospel had been authenticated, the foundation laid, and the message spread throughout the known world. The age of apostolic signs gradually gave way to a period where faith was based more on scripture and tradition than on miraculous experiences. But during those crucial early decades, when Christianity was fighting for survival against overwhelming opposition, God provided exactly the kind of supernatural protection His people needed. The poison miracles weren't just about individual preservation, they were about ensuring that nothing could stop the advance of His kingdom. These accounts remind us that the same God who protected the early disciples is still sovereign today, still capable of miraculous intervention when His purposes require it. The methods may change, but His power remains constant across the centuries. The disciples' miraculous survival teaches us profound truths about divine protection that remain relevant for believers today, though we must be careful to understand these lessons properly without falling into dangerous presumption. First, this story reveals that God's protection is real and available to His people, especially when they face persecution for their faith. The same power that neutralized deadly poison in the disciples' bodies is still active today, capable of shielding believers from harm when it serves His purposes. This isn't just ancient history, it's a demonstration of ongoing divine care. However, there's a crucial distinction between trusting God's protection and testing it. The disciples didn't seek out poison to prove their faith. They were targeted by enemies and protected by God's grace. They trusted His promise when danger came to them, rather than creating danger to test His promise. This difference is vital for modern believers to understand. The story also shows us that God's protection often serves a greater purpose than just individual safety. The disciples' survival became a powerful evangelistic tool that led to numerous conversions and strengthened the entire church. Sometimes God allows us to face dangerous situations not to harm us, but to demonstrate His power through our preservation. This challenges our modern tendency to avoid all risk in Christian service. While we shouldn't be reckless, we also shouldn't let fear of persecution or danger prevent us from boldly sharing the gospel. The same God who protected the early disciples is still watching over those who serve Him faithfully today. The poison miracle also teaches us about the supernatural dimension of spiritual warfare. The disciples weren't just facing human enemies, they were confronting demonic forces that sought to destroy God's work through human agents. Their protection came not through human wisdom or precaution, but through divine intervention that transcended natural law. For contemporary believers, this means recognizing that our real battles aren't against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil. While we should use common sense and take reasonable precautions, our ultimate security comes from God's protection, not our own efforts to avoid every possible danger. The story warns us against the opposite extreme as well, the presumptuous belief that we can deliberately expose ourselves to danger and expect miraculous protection. The disciples didn't drink poison voluntarily, it was forced upon them by persecutors. There's a significant difference between trusting God when danger finds us and creating danger to test His faithfulness. Modern applications might include missionaries serving in hostile territories, pastors preaching unpopular truths, or believers standing firm in their faith despite threats from family, employers, or governments. In such situations, we can trust that the same God who protected the early church is still capable of protecting His people today. The poison miracle also reminds us that God's methods of protection may not always be what we expect. Sometimes He delivers us from danger, sometimes He delivers us through it, and sometimes He uses the very attacks against us to accomplish His purposes. The key is trusting His wisdom rather than demanding specific outcomes. Ultimately, this story calls us to live with holy boldness, knowing that our lives are in God's hands and that nothing can touch us outside His will. Whether He chooses to protect us miraculously or allow us to suffer for His name, we can trust that His purposes are always good and His power is always sufficient. And there you have it, one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of divine protection in church history. Disciples who should have died from lethal poison instead walked away completely unharmed, turning a murder plot into a miracle that transformed an entire community. This wasn't just about surviving a poisoning attempt. This was about the faithfulness of a God who keeps His promises, even when those promises seem impossible. When Jesus told His followers that deadly poison wouldn't hurt them, He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was making a covenant backed by supernatural power. The enemies of the gospel learned a hard lesson that day. You cannot destroy what God has chosen to protect. Their carefully planned assassination became the most effective evangelistic campaign the early church could have asked for. Their weapon of destruction became an instrument of salvation for countless souls. But this story isn't just ancient history, it's a living reminder for every believer who faces opposition for their faith. Whether you're dealing with workplace persecution, family rejection, or even physical threats, the same God who neutralized poison in the disciples' bodies is still watching over you today. The question isn't whether God has the power to protect you. This story proves He does. The question is whether you'll trust Him enough to live boldly for His kingdom, even when the risks seem overwhelming. Will you let fear of what might happen keep you from doing what you know He's called you to do? The disciples didn't seek out danger, but they didn't run from it either when it found them. They trusted Jesus' promise completely, and that trust was rewarded with miraculous preservation that became a testimony for generations. Maybe you're facing your own poison cup right now, a situation that seems designed to destroy your faith, your ministry, or your witness. Remember this story. Remember that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to protect and preserve His people today. Don't let this incredible account end here. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exploring the most amazing stories of divine intervention in biblical history. Next week, we'll uncover another mind-blowing tale that will strengthen your faith and challenge your understanding of God's power. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no weapon formed against God's people can prosper, not even poison designed to kill. And remember, when you're walking in obedience to Christ, you're under divine protection that transcends every natural law. The cup of poison has been drunk and conquered. Will you trust the God who makes such victories possible?